Hello and welcome, everybody. If you're joining us live, it's great to see so many of you. And if you're watching on catch up, we hope you enjoy rewatching and finding out all the questions that you have sent us. I am Bec and this is Chris. We are the authors of Written, How to Keep Writing and Build a Habit That Lasts. We also have a newsletter called Breakthroughs and Blocks. And as writing productivity coaches, we like nothing more than hearing about your writing dilemmas. We are here to answer all your questions. If you're watching live, please do post them in the Q&A below. If you're watching on catch up, do add them, to the comments below and we'll come back to you. But we've also been sent quite a few in advance already. So we've got some lined up. So without further ado, are we ready to go?
I think so.
Okay. Right. We have the first question came by email from Cricket. And they asked, how do you make time to write, stick to it, and keep other things from distracting you?
Big question.
This kind of is the fundamental one. So we'll start with an easy one, shall we then? We're going to talk a bit more later around time because we've had a lot of questions specifically around making time. So we're going to focus this one on the distraction part. And the first thing I want to say about this is that some distractions are necessary. And if that happens, there's a tip that I just recently read from Annie Duke, who's an author, wrote a brilliant book called Quit. And she just said one trick to do is when you set a goal, add the word unless to it. So, I will work on my novel unless, the baby is crying, unless my boss is calling, or unless I get ill, which, recently happened to me and I had to give up, well, doing absolutely everything, actually. That is just something I think is quite helpful to understand that some distractions are necessary. We need to accept them. That's tough to do. I'm not going to pretend that's easy. But Chris is going to talk about different types of distraction.
Yeah, but there's a lot of distractions and interruptions that we have that are decidedly unnecessary, and these are the ones that we want to avoid. And it's really about thinking about what it is that is stopping you from getting the writing done, what it is that is making you unable to find the time. And one tip that we often give to our coaching clients is quite simply to create or to keep a distraction diary. And doesn't need to be too onerous at all. It really just means on a daily basis or whenever you write, just have a think about that. What are the things that you notice that are stopping you from getting the writing done? What is distracting you? And you'll tend to find that things tend to split into two categories. There are external distractions. So external distractions are the kind of things like your email, your phone, your work, your partner, those kind of distractions, external distractions. And then there are these internal distractions, which are the kind of doubts and fears and worries and feelings of overwhelm that we all have when we're writing. And very often the internal and external distractions that we have are very much linked. But the first thing to do in terms of thinking about what it is stopping you is notice these distractions that are getting in the way.
Yeah, and I think we call it distraction tracker.
Yeah.
And it just reminded me the last time we did a Q&A, somebody, I think it was Maria, was saying that they have a huge resistance to tracking of any type. And it just might be helpful just to talk about what we mean when we say tracking, and what the benefits are and how to make it work for you. We often think about tracking things like time. We might track the number of days we work. We might track our word count. And these can be helpful for some people, not for everybody. If you feel resistance, there's something going on there. But tracking distractions is a really helpful way of figuring out what's going on with that. In the same way, you might want to figure out like how much writing can I get done in half an hour or an hour. So you might want to track your word count for a little bit. These are all different experiments to run. But my top tip is to do it in a way that works for you. So tracking is about gathering data. It's about understanding yourself a little bit more, tracking time of day. I write best in the morning or the evening. That's a very simple thing to track. The way I track now is I just have a diary and I put a cross for the day I write. Simple as that. It's not every single day, but I can start to see that I might be writing 4 out of 7 days a week.
And I think doing it in a way that's that suits you and works for you is incredibly important, because I'm not a fan. I'm quite resistant to tracking myself, and I think when I'm thinking about when I started thinking about why it was that I was resistant, I think it comes back to the fact that I often don't know why I'm doing it. It just feels like an extra thing that I've got to do, and I kind of think, well, why am I doing this thing? And that often comes back to me. There was a If you've been around us for a bit, you'll probably know that we're big fans of the Gretchen Rubin's 4 Tendencies quiz. We'll put it in the links or whatever it is, so you can take it if you haven't taken it. Really, really useful thing to do. And I found out that I'm a questioner. Basically, I don't move on until I understand why I'm doing something. It makes me an absolute joy to work with as well, obviously. But yeah, so that's it's about, part of it is about thinking about why it is that you are resisting. And the way I got around this, because I started making it easier for myself and started to understand why I was tracking. And I just did a simple kind of tick in a box after I've done a day's worth of writing, and that actually gave me the reward I needed and the motivation I needed to move on. Also, the other quick thing is that tracking just does not need to be arduous, does not need to be complicated, because it often, people think that they have to ask themselves all these complicated questions, and you really don't. As I say, just for me, just a tick in the box, that are in the diary, just something that says that you've done a writing session is good enough to keep you motivated sometimes.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And it's all about, gathering data, understanding yourself a little bit better. And that helps you, yes, you figure out what works for you so you can carry on doing it, but you can also figure out what doesn't, which means you can stop doing it, which can be as important, if not more so.
Right, shall we move on to another?
Yes,
We have had an email from Juliet. This is an interesting one. So she asks, is swapping between genres, and in her case it's poetry and short stories, but it could be multiple genres. Is that a good idea, or does it just mean that you don't focus on either?
Yes. So this is
Interesting.
this. I mean, this is it's such a good question, and it's something that we all grapple with, because it's that kind of idea about whether we should single task or multitask. And there's a lot of kind of research coming up around focus and attention and multitasking. But the way I like to think about this is that there's a couple of people who talk about it really beautifully. There's a phrase that the writer and journalist and podcaster Dolly Alderton used, and she referred to it as like creative monogamy. She used to have a dating column, so she knows a lot about monogamy. But I think Tim Harford, who again was a journalist, an author, he had a brilliant book on creativity called Messy, and in that he talked about slow motion multitasking. And I think this is a really good concept, because when we think about multitasking now, we're thinking about switching between tasks really fast. And what he was saying, and the research that he did, was looking at slow motion, like over a lifetime. And he used the example of someone like Darwin and all of his rather bizarre hobbies and interests and the things he wrote about. But he also did some research into scientists, and he found that the most prolific scientists had several projects on at any one go. And actually, of their first 100 papers, so he looked specifically at prolific ones, he found that they switched topics 43 times in their first 100 papers, which I think is a really fascinating thing about like how we discover what we like writing. We often don't know, so we play around, and I'm using play intentionally, even though we are super serious about it. We can play with different genres, we can play with different types of writing. And I find, as someone who's starting to write fiction as well as nonfiction, that everything I do in my fiction really helps how I structure and write my nonfiction, which will be for newsletters, for long form articles, and for books. So I don't know if that's completely answered the question, but it's talked a little bit about.
Yeah, I was just going to say, because it actually brings us on to a similar question, which was about the tips that we have, if you have lots of different, well, very similar question actually. If we have lots of different writing projects on the go, fiction versus non-fiction, non-fiction like articles or newsletters or so forth, and blogs and blogging for businesses. So how do you balance all of that, and should you focus on one more than the other at a certain time? And I guess the rather unsatisfactory answer, as Bec has sort of given, is that it kind of depends, because what we often find is that sometimes people really, really value working on multiple projects or just two projects at once, because it means that they can kind of flick between them. And when one project is becoming maybe overwhelming or maybe a little boring or becoming arduous for them, then they can flick to the other project and focus some time on that as well. And it actually improves and increases their motivation.
Yeah.
Other people are entirely different in that they need that focus, that deep work time, that mental headspace to just focus on one thing. So it really does depend on how you work. And if you're not sure, just have a think maybe about how you've done another type of task that is not writing. Are you the kind of person that can juggle various things, that does feel motivated by switching between different tasks, or do you need to sort of focus on one?
Yeah. So it's just, if you're interested in that idea of creative monogamy, deep work, Cal Newport is brilliant writing about that. If you are more the sort of person who flicks between, I love hearing from writers who do this, and there is some benefit in terms of novelty. I think that's what Chris was talking about in terms of motivation.
Yeah.
When we have a habit, we get habituated, which means we get bored. And this happens, which is why we get attracted by the bright, new, shiny ideas. There are some writers I know who it's called procrastinating. I haven't quite pronounced that right, but procrastinating with other creative projects. And that's how they get so much done, because when they get bored of one, they go to the other one, and that gives them that dopamine hit and that excitement and that novelty to make progress on that. Then they get bored of that, and then they go back to the first one. And someone like Kathy Rensenbrink, when we interviewed her last year, said exactly the same thing. She has only written so much because she procrastinates with other books. When she's promised a novel or a non-fiction book to her publisher, the first thing she wants to do is go and write something else, which is why she's got a nice back catalogue now.
But I was just going to say, but in terms of finding out whether you need to take different approaches to different types of writing, just experiment and play around. We've just run our reset course over the last 6 weeks, and one really interesting insight from that was that they were spending ages and ages and ages. There was two of them actually. They were spending ages and ages working on their Substack newsletters, and they gave themselves a little challenge, which was, can I just spend 1 hour on my Substack newsletter instead of giving it all my time and attention in the same way that I'm giving my non-fiction project? And they were able to really dash those Substack articles out in a period of time they never thought they would be able to do. So just play around with different approaches as well.
Yeah. So don't feel bad if you've got multiple writing projects, except that you have. This is the reality for us. We need to write for our business. We need to get our newsletter out. We need to carve out time for our next book. And then we also like to have creative side projects as well. And I think I'm going to hop into one of the questions that's coming through in the Q&A box. So if you've got any of these, put them in there. This is from Nisha, who wants to ask. So I try to plan in advance the topic I want to write about during my morning writing session. So it sounds like Nisha's great at setting aside the time, but what they said is, I start off well, but then some other idea or topic pops into my head and I can't resist pursuing it. I just can't focus on the original topic until I write about the new topic. So this happens on a regular basis, and as the result, I struggle to finish anything. So this is quite similar to what we've been talking about at a project basis. So we've been talking about monotasking or multitasking across different projects. This is very much about what happens in a session. Now, Chris spoke before about the distraction diary, and I think this is a helpful tool, or understanding why the distraction diary works in terms of kind of what's going on inside our heads for neuroscience. So when we're concentrating on something, actually writing is quite generative. you know, if we're in a session, if we're in flow, we will have other ideas, and we don't actually want to squash them all down. So what's happening with our brains then is that this idea pops up and it's kind of nagging away. Having a distraction diary or having a notepad next to you when you get these new ideas, write them down, because what that does is that calms down the brain to make you feel that it's been heard. And this is a good tip for inner critic, which we'll talk about later because we've got some good questions on doubts and fears. A new idea pops up, write it down. What you're doing, telling your brain, I have heard you, I accept this new idea, I write it down. And you might actually find, Nisha, that stops you worrying about it. It might calm down the brain so you can go back to the original task. The other tip we have is a very simple question. I use this myself. I use this all the time with the writers I work with, is when we get this new idea, sometimes it's a new idea, or sometimes it's a thought, I need to do some more research, or I need to go, oh, why don't I go and do this? You have to notice that thought. So it's kind of being quite mindful, really. This thought pops up, notice it. I need to go and do some more writing. I need to go and work on this new idea. And then you just ask yourself, do I need to do that right now? That's it. That's the question. Do I need to do that right now? And if you pause with that question, you might find that you don't, in which case you can go back to your original project. Sometimes you might need to go and do it.
And I think in terms of your original project as well, distraction is a funny thing because it's almost like there are pull factors and there are push factors. There are certain things about your current project that are pushing you away from it, and there are certain things about your new shiny thing that are pulling you away, pulling you towards it, if that kind of makes sense. So aside from as well as what Bec was talking about in terms of noting those things down, it might also be worth thinking about the project or what it is that your current project or your original project is pushing you away from. Why are you feeling pushed away from it? And if it's and this goes back to why having the distraction diaries can be really useful as well. Because we will go on to this later on, but one of the things that we often say to people is if you start to feel overwhelmed by your project or you feel those procrastination tendencies kicking in, just start scaling back and start going small again and start taking on less of that project, because it could be that you're just taking on too much and you're feeling intimidated by it, and that's one of the factors that are pushing you away from it.
Yeah, actually, Nisha, I'm going to add one more.
We will shut up in a bit.
We will stop about this one. But this is really important. You know, how do we finish the big projects that we want to work on? How do we make time for them? How do we pay attention to them when we've got them? And it was just that I'd had a really interesting conversation with a specialist working with neurodiverse writers in particular. And I really learned a lot from that conversation around how the brain works in terms of novelty and distraction. And actually, when we get these new ideas, they're very exciting, which is why our attention can be quite scattered and we want to go off to them. But actually, the brain again will calm down. So it's a little bit, you get this hit of an idea, which gives you a big rush and an excitement to go and follow it. If you just sit with it for a little bit, you will normalize that and it might pass. So there is something about sitting with that excitement, and then the new idea isn't going to become as, you know, not as boring, but as kind of like as commonplace as your main project. But it can be a practice that you can work on in terms of how your brain works and how the kind of, we're not just following the hits of the new and exciting and what the dopamine is telling us to do. Okay, new question.
Right, so this is from Beth. So I'll give you some, I hope I understand this correctly, Beth. So Beth is she's at a point, a little bit of context, she's at a point where she's shifting from writing in a what we would call like more of a kind of spontaneous way, in a kind of unplanned way, kind of in small pieces of time throughout the day or throughout the week. And that at this point, it's absolutely fine that she's been writing like that, because she's been writing newsletter articles and LinkedIn posts and that kind of thing, and that's been working for her. But she wants to start taking on bigger projects. I'm assuming she wants to write a book of some type. So she needs to move away from this spontaneous type of writing. Also, because she has family commitments and so forth, which means that she can't write something quite deep in those small pockets of time. So she's asking, and she's struggling. So
Yeah.
what kind of advice do we have for her?
So the first thing I want to say is that it's just amazing to find out how Beth had started writing. So, really focusing on short form pieces that she could fit into her daily life. And this is the way the habits are built. You start small. There's loads of great research on this. And if anyone has read BJ Fogg on tiny habits, this is exactly what you would do. Start with a starter step, which could be short form writing, and get into the habit of writing those and getting them out there. So I think particularly for Beth, it was getting things onto LinkedIn and starting a newsletter. But it's like that sense that you're working towards a big goal, and that there does feel like there's a gap, because those shorter form things can fit in the time of day in a different way to the things that need deeper work. So what we're going to do is we're going to talk a little bit about time and how writers find time. Again, if you have been reading us or heard us talk before, we always talk about how to find time. I'll try and do it in a quick recap, but I think it's really important. I need reminding of this all the time. So perhaps you are exactly the same. But we've been doing research with writers for over a decade. We've had 3,500 people take some of our time surveys, and we have found 4 patterns for how writers find time. None of them are better than the other. The research will say different things. So, you might have heard that the only way to write is to do daily writing, and the research does show this is very, very productive. But if that doesn't work for you, I don't want you to feel bad. You're not doing anything wrong. It's just not working for you. So what I'm going to say is that there are 4 types. So daily writing, traditional kind of habit, same time, same place. The second type is the thought that Beth has been using, which is spontaneous, which is like time confetti. It's often called things like snacking or toggling, and this is grabbing small moments of time throughout the day. It's often unplanned. The third type is time boxing, which is a scheduled approach to writing. So you might have 2 or 3 writing sessions across a week that you book in advance and you treat like any other appointment. And the fourth and most controversial type is binge writing. I'd much rather call it deep work, but it's rare. It's very rare. You might only do it once a month or even less. So it's the kind of classic sabbatical, going on a writing retreat, that kind of thing. We find for many writers, they combine different types of how they use time. And I really do encourage people to use spontaneous, because it's surprising how much you can get done in a short space of time. But if you're trying to make that switch, it can feel quite alien. And as with everything, and anything we advise, or anything any other writing coach or writer says, is treat the advice lightly and use it as a hypothesis to run an experiment. So I would say, if you're looking at moving from a spontaneous approach, try something like the scheduled one, or spend some time tracking when you do fit it in, and you might find that actually your spontaneous sessions aren't as spontaneous as you think they are. They might actually always occur around the same times of day. So it's worth noticing that, and then thinking like, okay, if I'm always grabbing 15 minutes before lunch or after lunch, can I make that half an hour? Can I make that an hour? Block it in and see if that works for you.
And it does really go back to we do harp on about tracking quite a lot, but a lot of it does come down to that as well, because if you're not aware of how you use the time and where you have those pockets of time, then it's always going to be pretty difficult to actually shift your approach from one to another. And one tip that we give people very often is this whole idea of traffic light scheduling. So green, red, and amber. Basically, look through your diary in the next week or the next couple of days or the next day, and look at all the times in your day or in your night that you definitely can't do any writing, and color these in red if you want to color them in, or think of them as being your red periods of time, and then basically forget about those periods of time, and then look through the same days again, and look for all the periods of time that are amber. And what we mean by amber is that you probably can do some type of writing in those times. Not necessarily deep work writing, but you could probably do some planning or some editing or some light research or something like that, and then colour those in yellow. And thirdly and finally, look for those pockets of time that you definitely can do some writing. And these are your green times. And it's your only job, once you've coloured them in green, to then protect them, because that's your job, to protect them with your life, because those are really important.
Yeah, yeah. We've got a few more questions around time, so I think it'd be quite nice to explore some of these, and then we can come back to questions in that you're posting. Keep posting them in the box. We're going to answer as many of them as we can, and we're going to follow up with more. If we've got if we run out of time, we will follow them up on the newsletter and put them there.
Incidentally, I was just going to say, we have just sort of redeveloped a time quiz. Time is called What's Your Writing Personality, but it is more about how you use time. And we had a bit of a glitch this afternoon, so I hope it's still working. But you can sign up to it. It's all free and all that kind of stuff, all from our website at writtenacademy.com. Just have a look at that, because that might be quite useful for you. There's lots of other resources there as well, our blog and Substack newsletter and all that kind of stuff.
We'll pop the links in as well afterwards. Okay, here's a really good one about is there any research that shows how people reserve mental energy to write when they have a full-time demanding job? So again, this is the classic, how do we find time when we don't have control over all of our time? So just as Chris was speaking about the traffic light approach, that's a good way of understanding how much time you have. And this is something that Oliver Burkeman talks about really, really beautifully, actually. He talks about, understanding our limitations and how liberating it is to be able to do that. And he focuses on discretionary time. So that is the times we have in our day where we have a choice. And for many of us, we don't have a lot of choice over our time. Our lives are busy. There are lots of other things we have to do, like having jobs. So what's really important, first of all, is accepting your limited time, focusing on your discretionary time, and then running experiments to see when and how you can write. One thing I really I'm really keen on is that we often have these assumptions about when is a good time of the day for us to write. Again, the research shows that writing in the morning is what many creatives and writers do, and it's absolutely great, but it doesn't work for all of us. And I just want to say that the research, when you look into writing and productivity, the research will say something, and that research is great and it's sound. But if you are not one of the people who fills into that norm, into that bell curve, it can feel really alienating. So don't worry about that, because I found another piece of research that it's that we're more creative at the opposite end of the day. So while we are more productive at certain times of the day, if we're a morning person, we're very productive first thing in the morning, but actually morning people are more creative at the opposite end of the day in the evening. Likewise for night owls, they're not very productive first thing in the morning, but they are quite creative. And I think it's something to do with how awake our brains are. I find that fascinating. And if you're interested in chronotypes, do take one of the chronotype quizzes that are online. It's one of them, it's just called Morningness and Eveningness. Again, we will pop the link below. I love answering those sorts of quizzes online if you haven't realized, but it will just tell you where you fall based on typical behaviors that you do throughout the day, whether you have a more productive time of day.
But I mean, well, a lot of this process is about not assuming that that one approach will work for you, and just moving forward with an experimental mindset, with an open mindset, and just trying different things, because it can often surprise you, basically.
Yeah. So I'm getting distracted now, looking at all the brilliant questions that are coming in. I'm going to do a quick couple more on time, and then we'll go to some that are being posted. Because so we had that question then, which was around working. There was another sort of a writer recently was moving house and was just wondering whether to stop writing completely. And I just thought that is something that we often feel, that when we have we're knocked off course by very big life events. Some of them are of our own choosing, some of them are not. Is it just better to abandon it? And I think, sometimes that is the case. We have to give all our attention to something. But actually, I find for many writers and creatives, it's really important to keep in touch with our writing in just a low key kind of way. So whether that is journaling, capturing ideas, doing morning pages, that can be quite a nice way of feeling that we are being creative in a time that isn't particularly creative for us. But actually, going to go back to this thing around acceptance. If we are knocked off course, if something does happen to us, we do need to accept that and stop feeling guilty about this. And this is often how binge writers work, is they know they cannot do anything for a month, for 2 months. So they set their plan to do a retreat, to have a couple of days writing, perhaps 4 hours one afternoon. And they do everything they can to support to make that happen. And then they can turn their attention where it's really needed in the present.
No, I was just going to say that might. We just had a question come in saying, I'm curious how people protect their energy, which kind of goes back to a point that I can't remember who made it before, but anyway, it was made before. So I'm curious how people protect their energy in order to write. Sorry.
Oh yeah, sorry.
I was just reading it. It's easy to get mentally and emotionally drained and feel like you're meeting the page empty-handed.
Yeah, Stephanie, this is a great question. So one thing to note is that writing is it's a higher brain function. It's very tiring, and your brain is using up more energy than it is in lots of other ways, which is going to leave you feeling drained and tired. So it's interesting to notice how your energy feels across a writing session and how it changes. I know one of the kind of the sort of tips that I've developed for my own writing is that I can do my, at the end of a session, I get very, very tired, and I often feel quite low and down. So I use that trick of noticing good things as a form of, it's kind of rewiring my brain to associate good things with my writing. Because if I finish a writing session tired and drained, I'm going to be more negative about it, which means it's going to be harder for me to come back. And in terms of building a habit, we need to have a sense of reward to be able to turn up to the page again. In terms of measuring your own energy, I do find that our attention can be very scattered, particularly if we're coming back to a project or we haven't been writing for a long time. We might only be able to pay attention for 10 minutes or 15 minutes. So just start to notice how long you can write for. This is where Pomodoro can be really helpful. I actually have, it's just a 15-minute timer, just one of these on my desk. That I have, and it's just 15 minutes. And I just say, right, I'm just going to pay attention for 15 minutes. And at the end of that session, I'll go, can I do another one? And that's a good way of me kind of putting constraints in. It's keeping the bar quite low. And also, it's like testing the assumption, am I too tired to write? So what you don't want to do is think, I'm too tired to write, and then don't do a session. Instead, what you want to do is go, I'm feeling really tired. I don't know if I can write. I'm going to run an experiment for 10 minutes, and then I'm going to make a decision at the end whether I am too tired or not. And what that has the benefit of doing is means you can stop writing and not feel bad about it because you gave it a go.
And I mean, that's what we often call the 10-minute test, and it's often quite a good one for to help you think through if you are procrastinating or not. This is a slightly different bit of a tangent, but often when we're working on multiple projects, often when our work, we're not quite, when it's also our work, it's actually quite difficult to know if you're procrastinating or not. So we just ask people to just take 10 minutes and see whether you can do something, see whether you can push it along in some way. And if you can't, then that's absolutely fine. But often people can. It's just an assumption that they can't.
Yeah, we had a similar question from somebody who can only do the binge writing. So they go on writing retreats and then are unable to concentrate and procrastinate. And I think this comes back. It's a similar approach to that sense of like guarding your energy. It's like to put constraints, to set small steps and limits, and to watch them build up. And there was some interesting research. I can't remember who did it now, but it is quoted in the book about how many writers will only write for, it's like up to 3 hours. So people have done time use studies going through writers' journals and memoirs and biographies, and basically 3 hours seems to be the absolute max for almost all creatives. But most of us still can't even do it. I couldn't do 3 hours now. So I start off with 10 minutes and I build myself up, particularly at the beginning of a project. And then I work out what my sort of sweet spot is. Generally, I can do about 45 minutes. I can concentrate and I need a bit of a break. If I'm lucky, I can do another 45 minutes. So, even in a good day, 90 minutes is, the most.
We've had another question just coming in from Helmut, which I think it goes back to some of the other points that we might have made. So maybe we've answered this one, Helmut, I'm not quite sure. But it's around, so Helmut is writing starting a blog, and he is basically seems to be pulled in different directions and finding it difficult to find his own voice and style. But he wants to write. He doesn't find the short pieces particularly satisfying, so he wants to. So he said he's turning in circles. So I think it might go back to the whole tracking distraction diary thing again, maybe.
Yeah, and I think so. From the way I understand your question, Helmut, is that you aren't finishing things. So in your head, you've got an idea about what finishing is, and I would just get you to just explore what that means for you. Is that based on what other people are doing, or is that based on the idea being so big that you aren't able to finish writing about it? And it kind of goes a little bit back to, this is a question that kind of combines the craft of writing with the practice of writing, because in terms of the practice of writing, when we finish things, we're more likely to go on and finish other things. So we do want to get to the end of stuff, but is it ready? So take that as a question. Can you make your idea smaller so you can write a smaller piece? I know you said you don't find short pieces satisfying. You really want to give enough time and attention and develop your idea. Have you ever got feedback on it? That sometimes we're not always the best judge of our own work. We often judge it far more critically than other people. So can you get someone else to read it? Is there a friend? If you're in an academic setting, is there somebody there who could have a look at it? What do they think? Can you have a series of blogs? So you might not have finished that topic, but you can, serialize it as people would do with short stories and things like that. This is a really big one, actually, and it's one that I don't think we can always answer by ourselves. But if I was you, I would journal some of your questions that you've got. What is finishing? What does that look like? Am I being perfectionist? Sometimes the choice of when doing something perfectly means we often end up doing nothing. Can we get feedback on those pieces? And is there a way of making them shorter but contributing to a larger whole? And then you get that sense of achieving a milestone, which will make you more likely to carry on.
We haven't got very long left, actually. That's gone very quickly, hasn't it? But just before we go, we just wanted to very briefly talk about our Substack newsletter, and just to say that this is a bit of an experiment, this Ask Us Anything at the minute. We've done one every kind of 6 months or so, but what we really want to do is to start doing more of these things and more quite really practical things to help you to keep writing. So this is what our Keep Writing Resource Center, that's a kind of, I think we might change the name, it's going to be. So basically it will be really practical events and threads and Q&As like this to help you to keep writing, and you can get access to it if you upgrade through our Substack newsletter. So we just hope you might want to take advantage of that, because we're really excited about it.
Oh, good, good. It's just a way that we can have a bit more engagement with people, and we can answer more of these questions, because this is what we love doing above all else. I think we've got I reckon we'll do another 10 minutes or so, and I think we can run through some questions, because we've got I just want to ask one more on time before we get on to doubts and fears, if that works for you, because we've got some good ones on doubts and fears that are coming through on the Q&A box. But one I wanted to ask about was around self-care for binge writers. So the research on binge writing is quite depressing, actually. They find that binge writers aren't as productive as other forms, but actually we find it can be an incredibly helpful approach if you plan for it.
It depends, yeah.
So it depends, the answer to everything. But I think this is also quite similar to how we push ourselves at the end of a project. So this might be that kind of, that finishing energy that we get. I think I wrote a poster at the end of the year called the end spurt, which is about like how the Germans have that brilliant word for pushing towards a finishing line. And actually, we can do that. There are occasions where we can really push ourselves. And some of you might have been, as students, the sort of person who stayed up all night to write an essay. It's okay to do that from time to time. It just isn't sustainable. So how do you build in self-care? And I think in the same way that someone who wants to plan a piece of deep work, they need to build in the structures around that. So, being prepared ahead of it, you don't prepare. I mean, I remember the first time I went on a writing retreat, and it was a disaster. It was an absolute disaster. I booked myself 3 days at Gladstone's library, which is my most favorite place in the whole world. It's a residential library that belonged to a former prime minister here in the UK. And it's absolutely stunning. But the first time I went, I saved up, I booked it in months in advance, and I turned up with a huge long to-do list, and I spent the first two days, or perhaps not 2.5 days, just doing work, answering phone calls, sending emails. And then I just finally had like my end spurt was the last afternoon of my writing retreat, where I finally got down to writing. So I learned a really valuable lesson. It was a very costly, it was a very frustrating lesson, but I learned about needing to prepare for my deep work, that if I am going to go on a writing retreat or have a sabbatical or something like that, you just need to be ready for it. And in terms of self-care, you can put your thumb down. It's bringing up little thumb marks there. Sorry. You need to prepare rest, and there's lots of different ways that we can build in rest. So if I go on a writing retreat, I just build in walks. I have to walk every so often. I can do my little 45 minutes, have a cup of tea, another 45 minutes, then go on a walk. For me, that's how I would get through the day. Lots of snacks, sugar, that kind of thing. Always take my yoga mat. Yeah.
So what about internal doubts and fears? These are the kind of distractions that lots of people have, and Victor's asked a specific question about it. So how do you keep, well, I mean, these are the things that everybody has in many ways when they write. So how do you keep going despite rejections and self-doubt?
Oh, Victor, I really, really feel for you, because this is a tough one. The first thing I want to say is that you are not alone. Having rejections is part of the writing and all creative practice. Actually, when we are creating for other people, we start off writing for ourselves, and that's how we build our confidence, we build our habit, and we build the sorts of writing that we can do. And then there's a time where we need to put it out into the world, and we need to do that in a way which is safe, that doesn't knock us off course. But for many of us, so there's bound to be some academic writers on here, rejection is part of the process, as it is if you're entering writing competitions, if you're applying for grants, if you're applying for residencies. Rejection is part of that. Submissions to magazines, it's part and parcel, and different writers build up different tactics for doing for it. What you need to do is shift your focus away from the success being the output, the goal of getting published, and more about the practice. How can you celebrate the submission? Where in the process can you stop and celebrate? And then again, and moving on to the next thing, we talk a lot about things like the quantity myth. We talk about the only way to get good is to keep doing things. It is true. That means we need to do something and move on. We're often the worst judge of our own work. I often put a lot of time and effort into it. Might be an article, a newsletter, and then I've spent my days on it, and then nothing happens. Weeks on it, years sometimes. Nothing happens, and then sometimes I can throw something out there and it gets picked up and gets a great response. The only way I can deal with that is just by moving on to the next thing. So really do think about how you can monitor your progress. What are your internal markers of success? Are you exploring your ideas more deeply?
And I just think it's just be kind to yourself as well. I mean, I think that's really, really important in that whole kind of process. And you know, as Bec said, make sure that you are booking in things that aren't, that make the process of writing not as arduous as you are experiencing it. Have a think about how you're using your time, how long you're spending at your desk. Are these the kind of things that are making the whole writing process slightly harder? A lot of people think they should be writing for far longer and far harder than they need to, and this is actually something that does trigger feelings of self-doubt and worry. So just have a think about those kind of things as well.
Yes, yeah, definitely. And I just we did have some more questions around the inner critic. And we're not gonna have time to sort of deal into them too deeply. One tip on the inner critic is much like the distraction one. So distractions are external and internal. Making a note of the internal ones can be really helpful. Making a note of what your inner critic says can be really, really helpful. I find that inner critics are quite boring and repetitive, and there's only 2 or 3 things they ever say, which might be, you're not a good writer. No one is going to like this. You can note those down and then turn them into hypotheses for how you test them. So it kind of goes a bit back to previous questions. How can you test that out? And I am just going to share one tip.
Okay, that's right.
On this, which is that some famous writers have named and created characters for their inner critics. Very famously, Julia Cameron's is called Nigel. Rosie Garland, who I interviewed a few years ago, she calls hers Doris. And just giving, we're creatives. Why not give them a name, give them a personality, answer them back? They are an aspect of us. Sometimes they can be, I like to think of my inner critic as my editor. I have turned them into an eagle-eyed editor. And when they say something isn't good enough, I just try to work out what that means and what do I need to do on my next edit.
I was just going to say, so I had a coaching client a while back, and she had quite a few worries and inner critic voices. And what she used to do, she used to note them all down on a post-it note during the week and just put them to one side. Yes, I've noticed that, and I'll just put it to one side. She did her best to try to not let that feeling or that thought distract her or interrupt her writing, because at the end of the week, what she did, she used to compile all her notes, and she used to probably have a glass of wine and then burn them all. That wasn't my suggestion. That's what she figured out would really work for her. And so actually for her, it became actually part of a ritual. It became a ritualistic thing that she used to do every week.
Yeah, burning those doubts
Have a go.
and fears.
If it works.
But that's what we're all about, is that there are so many bits of advice. There's so many productivity tips. There's so many great writers sharing their practice and their routine, and it can feel overwhelming. The key is to not compare yourself to them, to follow what's interesting and curious to you, to run them as experiments, and then the things that work, put them into your toolbox, your sandbox, have a play with them, and you will change. What worked for you a while ago might not work for you now, and that's okay. Something else will. So come along to things like this, post questions, hear how other people do things, and get inspired and test them out.
Okay, well, it is 10 to 7, so I think we're going to wrap up.
I think we'll draw a close to this. It's been such
Thank
a joy.
you.
I don't think we haven't answered all your questions, so we're going to go through them. We're going to put some of them onto the Substack. If you've not signed up to Breakthroughs and Blocks before, do check it out online. I am Bec. This is Chris.
And we will see you soon. Thank you so much for coming along.
Thank you so much. Bye then.